The crew exchanged nervous glances. They had followed Thorn through countless perils, fueled by his charisma and his unwavering belief in their success. But this time the air crackled not just with the promise of reward, but with the tangible threat of something ancient and terrible. Thorn's obsession had blinded him, turning him into a reckless fool, leading them all towards an abyss. He saw only the glittering prize, the ultimate validation of his ambition, and was utterly deaf to the dire warnings whispered by the very stone and metal that stood between them and the darkness. He was so consumed by the imagined wealth that he failed to see the precipice upon which he was leading them all. The glowing sigils pulsed, and Thorn, in his fevered state, mistook their ominous thrum for an invitation, their chilling radiance for the beckoning light of fortune. He was a man who had already lost himself, chasing a phantom treasure within a tomb, convinced it was a vault of untold riches. The clang of hammer against impossibly ancient metal was a sound that should have been swallowed by the immense silence of the Cyclopean labyrinth. Instead, each resonant strike seemed to be amplified, echoing and re-echoing in the oppressive stillness, a defiance against a quiet that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a deliberate, watchful suppression. Captain Thorn, his face a mask of fierce determination, his eyes still burning with that unholy fervor, stood over the colossal chains, his voice a harsh bark that cut through the tension. "More force," he commanded, his words sharp and unyielding. "Do you think these relics of some forgotten god were forged to be prized open with a whisper? Heave. Put your backs into it, you dogs. This is not the time for delicate touch. This is the time for brute strength, for the will of man to shatter the shackles of eternity." His crew, a collection of hardened sailors who had faced storms and sea monsters with a grim stoicism, now moved with a frantic, almost desperate energy. The flickering, sickly green light of the sigil seemed to imbue them with a borrowed madness, or perhaps it was Thorn's own unhinged conviction that had infected them. They wielded their tools, heavy hammers, crowbars, chisels fashioned from the hardest steel they possessed, with a ferocity that belied the almost geological resilience of the chains. Each blow was an exertion, a testament to their physical limits, and the sheer, unimaginable effort required to even scratch the surface of these titanic restraints. Davies, the quartermaster, a man whose muscles seemed carved from oak, swung his hammer with a brutal rhythm. Sweat beaded on his brow, mingling with the grime of the labyrinth, and his grunts of exertion were lost in the percussive symphony of their labor. He slammed the head of his hammer against one of the massive links, the impact sending a jarring vibration up his arms and into his very bones. The metal, impossibly smooth and cold, seemed to absorb the blow with a disdainful indifference. A faint spark, a mere glint of light, was the only tangible result. "It's like hitting bedrock, Captain," Davies roared, his voice strained. This ain't just iron. It's something else, something hard as the stars themselves." Thorn, however, was undeterred. He strode along the length of the chain, his gaze sweeping over the intricate patterns, the alien runes that pulsed with that unnerving luminescence. "Exactly," he countered, his voice ringing with triumph. "And the harder the lock, the more precious the treasure it guards. Do not falter. Imagine the glory. Imagine the power. This is not merely labor. This is the act of gods. We are carving our names into the annals of history with every swing of your hammer." The sounds they made were a stark contrast to the profound quiet that had reigned before. The rasp of metal on metal, the heavy thuds of hammers, the sharp crack of a chisel biting into the alien alloy. strained breaths and guttural cries of the men. All these sounds became the new, violent heartbeat of the labyrinth. They were the sounds of a cage being broken, of a slumbering entity being roused. Each successive blow chipped away infinitesimally at the colossal seals, but it was the accumulation, the sheer, unrelenting pressure of their combined efforts that began to make a difference. Elias watched from a distance, his heart a tight knot of dread. He saw the sweat, the strain, the sheer physical agony etched on the faces of the crew. He heard the desperation in their grunts, the fear in their strained shouts. Thorn's fervor was a contagion, but Elias felt only the cold, creeping certainty that they were disturbing something that was meant to remain undisturbed, that they were playing with forces that defied human comprehension. He saw the sigils, once glowing with a steady, menacing light, begin to flicker more erratically as the chains were attacked. It was as if the very wards themselves were reacting, their internal energies being taxed, their power waning with each calculated assault. "Careful, Thorn," Elias called out, his voice carrying across the expanse of the chamber. "These wards are not mere decorations. They are actively resisting. You can see it in the light, in the air itself." Thorn merely waved a dismissive hand, his eyes never leaving the chains. Resisting, or merely protesting their inevitable undoing. They are the last vestiges of a dying power, Elias, and we are the dawn of a new one. He pointed to a section of a chain that had been subjected to relentless prying. A minuscule fissure had appeared, a dark line against the alien metal, barely perceptible to the naked eye. "Look, a breach, a chink in their armor. This is not resistance. This is surrender, albeit a reluctant one." The men, spurred by Thorn's relentless enthusiasm and the faint, yet undeniable progress they were making, redoubled their efforts. They focused their attacks on the points where the chains interlocked, where the sigils were most densely concentrated. The air around these focal points grew noticeably colder, a biting, unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the very metal itself, as if the energy being expended was being drawn from the surrounding environment. The hum that Elias had first noticed earlier, a subtle vibration that seemed to resonate deep within his bones, began to grow in intensity. It was no longer a subtle thrum, but a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to emanate from the heart of the labyrinth, from the sealed chamber itself. The sigils, as they were increasingly assaulted, began to lose their luminescence. The vibrant, sickly green faded, replaced by a dull, intermittent pulse. It was like watching embers die out, or a vital organ begin to fail. Each flicker seemed weaker than the last, and with each fading glow, the oppressive silence that had been so carefully maintained by the wards began to break. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and the air, which had been thick with a chilling stillness, now began to feel charged, electric, pregnant, with an unseen force that was rapidly gathering strength. Davies swung his hammer again, and this time with a sickening crack, a segment of a smaller, secondary chain designed to bind the main links snapped. The sound was sharper, more violent than anything before, and it was met with a sudden, profound silence. The rhythmic clang of hammers ceased. The men looked at each other, their faces illuminated by the dying light of the sigils, a dawning apprehension replacing the frenetic energy of their labor. "One down," Thorn breathed, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. He moved towards the broken link, his eyes fixed on the place where the sigil had been brightest. As the last vestiges of its green light sputtered and died, a new sound emerged from within the sealed chamber, It was a low, resonant hum, deeper and more powerful than the previous vibrations. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical sensation, a pressure that pushed against their chests, making it difficult to draw a full breath. It's awake," whispered Finn, the ship's navigator, his voice trembling. Thorn ignored him, his gaze already fixed on the next seal. "Awake and eager," he declared. "The first barrier has fallen. The path is opening." The crew, though unnerved, were still under Thorn's thrall. They moved to the next seal, their movements more hesitant now, but still driven by the captain's insatiable hunger. The process was agonizingly slow, each segment of chain a Herculean task to break. They worked with chisels, widening the fissures, forcing wedges into the impossibly tight joints. The metal groaned under the strain, a metallic lament that seemed to echo the groans of the straining men. With each section they managed to pry apart, another sigil would flicker and die, and the hum from within would deepen its timbre, growing in intensity. The air itself seemed to change. It grew thicker, heavier, not with dampness, but with a palpable, unseen energy. It tasted metallic on their tongues, and a faint ozone smell, like that preceding a violent thunderstorm, began to fill the chamber. The crew, accustomed to the salt spray and the bracing winds of the open sea, found this alien atmosphere suffocating, disorienting. Yet Thorn seemed to thrive in it, his eyes blazing, his breathing deep and steady, as if he were inhaling pure power. "The resonance," Thorn murmured, his voice a low thrum that seemed to blend with the growing hum from the vault. "Can you feel it? It's not a sound, it's a frequency, a language that speaks directly to the soul. They built this place, not just to contain, but to resonate, to amplify." As they labored, the crew began to notice other changes. The faint, almost imperceptible vibrations in the stone floor intensified. They felt it in their teeth, in their sternums, a persistent tremor that was slowly but surely growing. The sheer scale of the endeavor was beginning to take its toll not just on their bodies, but on their minds. The relentless pounding, the constant exertion, coupled with the unnerving sensory shifts, were pushing them towards a state of near delirium. Davies, after a particularly difficult struggle with a massive locking mechanism, managed to wrench it free with a sickening shriek of protesting metal. The sigil guarding it flared one last time, a blinding flash of green, and then extinguished completely. The resulting silence, before the deeper hum reasserted itself, was deafening. "By the sea gods," Davies panted, leaning on his hammer. It's like a mountain breaking apart." And then it happened. As the last significant chain segment was pried loose, as the final sigil sputtered into oblivion, the low hum from within the vault didn't just deepen, it roared. It wasn't the sound of an engine starting, but the sound of a primal force awakening, of an ancient consciousness stirring from an eons-long slumber. The very stone of the labyrinth seemed to vibrate, not just with sound, but with an immense, terrifying pressure. The floor bucked beneath their feet, throwing several of the men off balance. Loose stones rained down from the impossibly high ceiling, creating a chaotic cascade of noise and debris that momentarily drowned out the resonant roar. The air, now thick enough to feel like a physical presence, pressed in on them, squeezing the breath from their lungs. It was a crushing weight, an invisible hand that seemed to grip their very beings. Thorn, however, stood unfazed, his arms spread wide, his face tilted upwards towards the unseen source of the sound, a look of utter, unadulterated ecstasy on his features. "Yes," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the cacophony. "Yes, it is awake, the treasure, the knowledge. It is finally being revealed." Elias staggered, bracing himself against a pillar. He could feel the raw power emanating from the sealed chamber, a power that was not just immense, but utterly alien. It was the energy of creation and destruction intertwined, of forces that predated human understanding. The breaking of the seals had not just unlocked a door, it had shattered a fundamental containment, unleashing something that had been bound for an unfathomable age. The physical labor had been immense, the sound of their efforts deafening, but it was the palpable shift in the atmosphere, the terrifying guttural hum that now filled the labyrinth, that marked the true, irreversible breach. The prison was yielding, and the prisoner was stirring. Chapter 3. The Heart of Malice. The final chain link, a colossal segment of impossibly dense metal, gave way not with a clang, but with a resonant, sickening crack that seemed to fracture the very air. It was a sound that spoke of millennia of strain, of immense pressure finally succumbing. The vault, however, did not swing open on hinges of some forgotten design. Instead, it did something far more horrifying. A vast spiderweb-like fissure bloomed across its surface, a network of jagged lines radiating from a central point of impact. It wasn't an opening, it was a wound, a catastrophic tear in the fabric of reality itself. From this bleeding wound, a darkness began to seep, not the absence of light, but a positive, tangible entity of pure void. It was a suffocating, inky blackness that seemed to absorb all ambient illumination, not just from the dying sigils, but from the flickering torches held by Thorn's increasingly petrified crew. This encroaching shadow was not inert. It writhed, it coiled, it pulsed with a malevolent vitality that sent shivers down the spines of even the most battle-hardened sailors. A palpable pressure began to build, an unseen force that pressed against their chests, making each breath a laborious, gasping effort. It was as if an ocean of immense weight had been suddenly dumped upon them, pinning them down, crushing their very will. The air grew thick and cloying, carrying with it a sharp, acrid scent of ozone, like the aftermath of a titanic lightning strike, mingled with an even fouler, deeper aroma of decay, the smell of things that had lain undisturbed and rotted for untold ages. Captain Thorn, his earlier bravado dissolving into a mask of awe-struck dread, stumbled back a step. His hands, which had so eagerly wielded his tools of destruction, now trembled at his sides. The wild light in his eyes, once burning with the fire of conquest, had flickered and died, replaced by a dawning, bone-deep horror. He had sought power, wealth, the secrets of the ancients. He had found only oblivion. The shadows within the rent vault coalesced, swirling and churning like some unholy storm. They did not form a distinct, recognizable shape at first, but rather an amorphous, shifting mass that nonetheless possessed a terrifying, distinct presence. It was a formless entity, yet it felt ancient, immense, and utterly alien. The mere observation of it brought with it a profound sense of existential dread, a primal fear that transcended any earthly danger. This was not a beast to be fought, nor a demon to be banished. It was a tear in the fundamental order of the universe, and it was bleeding into their reality. The crew members recoiled further, their initial hope for riches and glory evaporating like sea mist in a harsh sun. Their grunts of exertion had long since ceased, replaced by choked gasps and whimpers of pure, unadulterated terror. They had not found wealth. They had unleashed a catastrophic doom from its ancient confinement. The very stone of the labyrinth, which had seemed so solid and immutable, now felt as though it was weeping, groaning under the immense, alien pressure that was being unleashed. Finn, the navigator, a man usually as steady as a ship's mast, clutched at his throat, his eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on the encroaching darkness. It wasn't treasure, he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. It was a cage. We broke the cage. Davies, the quartermaster, the strongest of Thorn's men, dropped his hammer with a clatter that was swallowed almost immediately by the burgeoning hum from the vault. He fell to his knees, not in submission but in utter, paralyzing fear. He had faced krakens, spectral ships, and the maddened eyes of dying men. But this was something else entirely. This was the chilling realization that they had poked a hole in the sky, and something terrible was looking back. The air, now thick with that unholy mixture of ozone and decay, seemed to press in on them, not just from the vault, but from all directions. It was a palpable miasma, an invisible shroud that clung to their skin and seeped into their lungs. The flickering green light of the last vestiges of the sigils, which had so recently pulsed with an almost vibrant menace, now guttered and died, leaving them in a deepening gloom that the encroaching void was swiftly extinguishing. Thorn, however, remained rooted to the spot, his gaze locked onto the coalescing darkness. His face, once alight with ambition, was now a canvas of dawning, abject terror. He had been so certain, so utterly, tragically certain. He had read the inscriptions, deciphered the fragmented prophecies, and believed he understood the purpose of this place. He had believed he was a liberator, a harbinger of a new age. Now he saw only the abyss he had so carelessly pried open. The amorphous shape within the vault began to solidify, to take on a semblance of form, though it defied earthly geometry and anatomical understanding. It was a shifting mass of shadow and impossible angles, a geometry that hurt the eyes to behold. Tendrils of deeper darkness, sharper than any blade, began to unfurl from its periphery, probing the edges of the fissure, reaching out into the labyrinth. The hum that had been growing steadily now intensified, becoming a guttural throb that seemed to vibrate through the very bedrock of existence, a sound that promised not revelation, but annihilation. Elias, watching from a slightly safer distance, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. He had warned them. He had pleaded with Thorn to cease, to respect the ancient wards. But his words had fallen on deaf ears, drowned out by the captain's insatiable hunger for power. Now the consequences were not just dire, they were cosmic. This was not a treasure to be plundered. It was a slumbering nightmare that they had awoken. The tendrils of shadow stretched further, lapping at the edges of the broken vault like some abyssal tide. Where they touched the stone, the rock seemed to darken, to decay, as if the very essence of life was being leached away. The crew members, paralyzed by fear, could only watch as the prison was not just opened, but shattered, and the monstrous entity held within began its inexorable escape. Thorn finally found his voice, a choked, desperate whisper that was barely audible above the growing roar from the vault. What have I done? So, he stammered, his eyes darting wildly, searching for an escape that did not exist. He looked at his crew, their faces contorted with terror, and saw not the devoted followers he had commanded, but a group of doomed souls standing on the precipice of oblivion. The entity's form, while still indistinct, began to exhibit a more unified, horrifying structure. It was as if the very concept of being was being warped and twisted into a new, terrifying manifestation. Imagine a void that could look at you, a silence that could listen, a nothingness that could reach out. The pressure intensified, not just pushing, but seeming to pull, to draw them towards the rent in reality, towards the heart of the malice they had unleashed. The ozone smell became overpowering, stinging their nostrils, and the decay grew more potent, a sickeningly sweet perfume of death that promised an end to all things. The ship, moored in the subterranean harbor, seemed to groan in sympathy, its timbers creaking as if under an unimaginable strain. The waters of the underground lake, previously still and placid, began to churn, disturbed by the nascent power seeping from the labyrinth. It was as if the entire world, down to its deepest, most hidden places, was reacting to the breaking of this ancient seal. Finn, regaining a sliver of his composure, pointed a trembling finger towards the central fissure. "The center," he whispered, his voice raspy. It's drawing it in. It's not just escaping. It's feeding on the void it creates." The implication was chilling. This entity wasn't merely a prisoner released. It was a force of unmaking, a tear in reality that sought to consume everything, starting with the very void it had been forced to endure. The darkness was no longer just bleeding out. It was actively expanding, pushing back the perceived boundaries of existence, a terrifying testament to the power of whatever cosmic forces had seen fit to imprison it. The labyrinth was no longer a tomb. It was a gateway, and they, the unwitting, or perhaps too willing, custodians, had just flung the door wide open. The echoes of Thorn's triumphant shouts were now a hollow mockery, replaced by the deafening roar of their ultimate undoing. The heart of malice was not a treasure to be found, but a terror to be unleashed. And it was hungry. The rent in the vault did not merely weep darkness. It began to birth it. From the deepest, most impenetrable core of the void that bled into their reality, a substance began to coalesce. It was not born of light, nor of shadow as they understood it, but of a third, abhorrent state of being that defied all earthly categorization. This was the genesis of the heart of malice, a form that had slumbered in the Stygian depths of its prison, a prisoner of unimaginable eons, now stirring and taking shape. It was the coalesced essence of everything that had been deemed unnatural, everything that had been feared and suppressed by the primordial cosmic order. Imagine not the fluidity of water, nor the solidity of stone, but a substance that was both and neither. It was a curdled darkness, a coagulation of what felt like pure, distilled dread. This was not a gentle blooming, but a visceral, sickening process, as if the very concept of existence was being forcibly extruded from a wound in the universe. Jagged shards of what appeared to be chitin, impossibly sharp and possessing angles that defied Euclidean geometry, began to erupt from the thickening mass. These were not mere decorative elements. They seemed to be integral to its very structure, extensions of its being, bristling with a predatory potential. They glinted with a dull, obsidian sheen, reflecting no light, but rather seeming to absorb it, adding to the oppressive gloom that clung to nightoid. The entity, and then the limbs. They unfurled not with the grace of a serpent or the deliberate movement of a biped, but with a disturbing, uncoordinated flailing that suggested a nascent consciousness struggling to assert itself. These were not appendages of flesh and bone, but writhing, tentacled horrors, each tipped with suckers that pulsed with an unseen life, or perhaps with the insatiable hunger of the void itself. They writhed independently, some exploring the edges of the fissure, others reaching blindly into the air, as if tasting the alien atmosphere of their new-found freedom. The texture of these limbs was not smooth, but seemed to be covered in a glistening, oily film, an exudate of pure malice. To behold the heart of malice was to confront a terrifying paradox. It possessed no discernible features of life as humanoids understood them. No eyes to gaze, no mouth to consume, no heart to beat. Yet it radiated an aura of ancient, malevolent intelligence. It was a consciousness that had existed outside the bounds of space and time, a being that had witnessed the birth and death of stars, and found them wanting. This was not a beast driven by instinct. It was an entity driven by a purpose so alien and profound that it could only manifest as pure, unadulterated dread. Its very presence was a violation of natural law, a blasphemy against the orderly cosmos. The form was maddeningly unstable. It was a constant state of flux, a horrifying ballet of coagulation and dissolution. One moment, the chitinous plates would shift and grind, producing a sound like 1,000 skeletal hands scraping against granite. The next, the tentacles would retract and then erupt with renewed vigor, probing and exploring the space around it. It was as if the entity was trying on different forms, different manifestations of its terrifying essence, searching for the one that best embodied its ancient, festering hatred. This instability was not a weakness, but a testament to its alien nature. It was a being that was not bound by the physical limitations that define terrestrial life. It was a manifestation of pure cosmic dread, a living embodiment of the anxieties that lurked in the deepest corners of the universe. The sheer wrongness of its appearance was enough to shatter the sanity of any observer. It provoked a visceral disgust, a primal revulsion that burrowed deep into the very soul. It was the stuff of nightmares made manifest, a creature that had been gestated in the cold, indifferent darkness between galaxies, a being from beyond comprehension, an ancient evil that had been imprisoned for eons, its rage festering and growing with each passing epoch. The labyrinth, Thorne's grand discovery, was not a treasure vault. It was a prison for such a being, a testament to a time when the universe understood the need to contain such horrors. Captain Thorne, his face a mask of utter despair, could only stare, his mind reeling. He had sought power, knowledge, the secrets of forgotten civilizations. He had imagined himself a discoverer, a conqueror of the unknown. Instead, he had become the jailer who had carelessly smashed the bars, unleashing something that was not meant to exist in the mortal realm. The air around the entity throbbed with a palpable malevolence, a pressure that was not merely physical, but psychic, an assault on the very core of their being. It felt as though the entity's presence was actively unmaking the reality around it, bleaching the color from the stone, leaching the warmth from the air, and sowing seeds of despair in the hearts of all who bore witness. The crew, their faces contorted in expressions of sheer terror, whimpered and fell back further, some collapsing to the ground, unable to stand under the crushing weight of the entity's oppressive aura. Their minds, accustomed to the tangible dangers of the sea, the clang of steel, the roar of cannons, were utterly unprepared for this existential threat. This was not a foe to be fought with cutlass or pistol. This was a primal horror, a breach in the very fabric of existence, and it was now free to wreak its aeons-old vengeance. Finn, the navigator, his eyes wide and unfocused, clutched a rough-hewn stone pillar, his knuckles white. He felt the cold seep not just into his bones, but into his very spirit. It's not a creature, he whispered, his voice cracking. It's a wound, a cosmic wound that's come to bleed us dry. He was right. The heart of Malice was not a being that lived. It was a being that unmade. Its existence was a testament to the deep, terrifying mysteries that lay beyond the veil of mortal understanding. A chilling reminder of the vast, indifferent emptiness that surrounded their fragile world. The entity continued its terrible unfolding. Tendrils, slick with an ichor that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, snaked out from its central mass, probing the broken remains of the vault. Where these tendrils touched the stone, the rock seemed to darken, to crumble, as if undergoing a rapid, horrifying process of decay. It was as if the entity was not just moving through space, but actively consuming it, leaving behind a trail of desolation. The very air around these tendrils crackled with an unseen energy, a silent testament to the destructive forces at play. Elias, who had watched Thorn's descent into madness with a growing unease, now felt a dread that surpassed any fear he had ever known. He had seen the strange glyphs, felt the latent power, and understood, on some instinctual level, that this place was a tomb for something terrible. Thorn's hubris had been the key that unlocked the abyss, and the heart of Malice was the monstrous prisoner that had been waiting for its release. It was a violation of the most sacred cosmic laws, a transgression that would undoubtedly have repercussions far beyond this subterranean chamber, far beyond this doomed expedition. The entity's form, while still amorphous and shifting, began to display a terrifying coherence. It was as if the chaos within was resolving into a specific, inimical pattern. Imagine a void that could perceive, a silence that could listen, a nothingness that could reach out and grasp. The pressure intensified, no longer a mere push, but a horrifying pull, a psychic suction that sought to drag them, body and soul, into the void that was the entity itself. The acrid tang of ozone, the precursor to its emergence, was now laced with a deeper, fouler scent. The cloying perfume of cosmic decay, the stench of things that had been dead for an eternity and were now stirring. It was the smell of the end of all things. The faint, subterranean echoes of the ship, the serpent's kiss, moored in the underground harbor, seemed to groan in response. Its timbers, weathered by countless storms, creaked and groaned, as if under an unimaginable strain. The placid waters of the subterranean lake began to churn and writhe, disturbed by the nascent power that was now bleeding into the very bedrock of the world. It was a visceral reaction from the planet itself, a tremor of revulsion at the violation that had occurred. The labyrinth, once a place of hidden knowledge, had become a gaping maw, and the heart of Malice was its first ravenous bite. Thorn's crew were not discoverers. They were the sacrifice offered to a cosmic hunger. The pulsating darkness that was the heart of Malice did not merely shift and writhe. It exhaled. This was not a breath of air, for no air could truly sustain such an unnatural entity. Instead, it was an exhalation of pure malevolence, a psychic effluence that washed over the terrified crew like a tide of putrescence. It was a miasma, a tangible corruption that attacked not the lungs, but the very core of their being, their sanity. This was not a sound that assaulted the ears, but a pervasive, insistent whisper that burrowed directly into the mind. It was a cascade of anti-thought, an insidious presence that spoke not in words but in the shattering of reasoned thought. It was a primal negation, a relentless erosion of the foundations upon which their minds were built. It spoke of oblivion, not as a peaceful rest, but as a consuming void, an ultimate and inevitable cessation of all. It whispered of the futility of existence, of the grand cosmic joke that was consciousness in a universe destined for dust. Every striving, every triumph, every love and loss, reduced to a meaningless tremor on the precipice of eternal nothingness. The effects were immediate and devastating. Men who moments before had stood in frozen terror now began to babble incoherently. Their hands flew to their heads, fingers clawing at their scalps, as if to dislodge the invasive tendrils of the entity's influence. Eyes, once wide with fear, now rolled back in their sockets, pupils dilated to pinpricks as their owners wrestled with the unraveling of their own identities. Reason, that most precious and hard-won faculty, fractured like brittle glass, each shard reflecting a distorted, terrifying fragment of the entity's nihilistic gospel. Their screams were not of pain, but of minds breaking, of souls being flayed by the relentless tide of despair. Corporal Davies, a man known for his stoic resilience, sank to his knees, his massive frame trembling. He mouthed silent words, his lips moving in a frantic, nonsensical rhythm. The light of comprehension had fled his eyes, replaced by a vacant, terrified stare. He was no longer Davies, the seasoned soldier. He was a shell, his consciousness being systematically dismantled by the psychic plague. He began to claw at his own chest, his rough fingernails tearing at his thick wool tunic, as if trying to expose a core that was already rotting from within. "It's all nothing," he rasped, his voice a dry croak. "The sea, the stars, Thorne's ambition, it's all just a stain that will be wiped clean." His words, though fragmented, carried the chilling echo of the entity's pronouncements. He was the first, but his descent was a harbinger of the fate that awaited them all. The air around him seemed to shimmer, a subtle distortion that was almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but undeniably present. The physical manifestation of this psychic miasma was as horrifying as its mental assault. A visible shimmer, like heat haze rising from a sun-baked deck, began to distort the cavern walls. It was not a uniform distortion, but pulsed and swirled with an unearthly energy. And within this shimmer was a distinct hue, a sickly, unsettling purplish tinge that seemed to leach the color from everything it touched. The stone of the labyrinth, once imbued with the muted browns and grays of ancient rock, now took on a bruised, necrotic appearance where the miasma brushed against it. Accompanying this visual corruption was a profound and penetrating cold. It was not the biting chill of the Arctic winds or the damp, biting cold of a winter storm. This was a cold that bypassed the skin, bypassing muscle and bone, to settle deep within the marrow, within the very soul. It was the cold of the void, the absolute absence of warmth, of life, of hope. It seeped into their bones, making their limbs heavy and unresponsive, amplifying the paralysis of fear and despair that had already begun to grip them. The very air, or what passed for it in this lightless abyss, felt brittle, charged with a negative energy that threatened to freeze them from the inside out. Captain Thorne, his own sanity fraying at the edges, observed the unfolding horror with a dawning ghastly comprehension. He had sought to harness a power that was not meant for mortal hands, a power that existed beyond the pale of natural law. He had seen the glyphs, felt the latent energies, and recognized the labyrinth for what it was, a tomb, a containment unit for something that had been deemed too dangerous to exist. And in his avarice, he had broken the lock. Now the prisoner was free, and its influence was a creeping poison, a subtle yet devastating weapon of cosmic nihilism. It feeds on us, Thorn stammered, his voice hoarse, his eyes wide with a terror that now superseded his ambition. Not our bodies, our minds, our belief, our hope. He looked at his crew, their faces contorted, their bodies racked by an invisible torment. He saw his own reflection in their fractured stares, a captain who had led his men not to glory, but to an abyss of existential horror. The heart of malice was not merely a physical presence. It was a philosophical plague, a cosmic disease that sought to spread its contagion of despair throughout the universe. The purplish shimmer intensified, coalescing in certain areas, like bruises forming on the skin of reality. Where it was thickest, the cold was almost unbearable, a physical manifestation of the dread that was permeating their very souls. Some men collapsed entirely, their bodies going limp as their minds surrendered to the onslaught. Others, in a desperate, futile act of defiance, tried to cover their ears, as if blocking out a sound that was not auditory, but existential. They would fall to their knees, their faces contorted, their mouths working silently as the anti-thought eroded their very sense of self. Young Pip, the cabin boy, a lad who had only ever known the sunlit decks of the Serpent's Kiss and the salty spray of the open sea, was found huddled against a wall, weeping uncontrollably. He spoke of his mother, of her warm hearth and her lullabies, but his words were punctuated by ragged gasps and shuddering cries. The comforting memories, once a bulwark against fear, were now twisted into instruments of torture by the entity's influence. The warmth of his mother's embrace was now described as a fleeting illusion, her lullabies as the hollow echoes of a dying world. His small frame shook violently, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He was a child's mind, exquisitely vulnerable to the cosmic horrors that now held them captive. And it says God is dead, Pip sobbed, his voice barely a whisper, but amplified by the unnerving silence of the cavern, a silence that was itself a testament to the entity's power. It says, "There's only darkness, and then nothing." The words were simple, childlike, yet they carried the weight of eons of cosmic despair. The entity's influence was not limited to complex philosophical arguments. It translated its bleak pronouncements into terms that even the most innocent mind could grasp, making the horror all the more profound. Even Elias, the stoic quartermaster, who had weathered mutinies and storms with unwavering resolve, found himself succumbing. He gripped the hilt of his cutlass, his knuckles white, but the weapon felt like a child's toy in his trembling hand. He felt a creeping lassitude, a profound indifference to the very struggle for survival. The whispers were growing louder in his mind, insidious suggestions of ease, of release, of the sweet oblivion that awaited them all. He found himself staring at the purplish shimmer, a morbid fascination drawing his gaze. The cold was no longer a discomfort. It was a perverse comfort, a feeling of being absorbed into something vast and timeless. He began to wonder if resistance was not only futile, but utterly pointless. The concept of pointless was itself a powerful weapon wielded by the heart of malice. The very stone of the labyrinth seemed to weep under the entity's influence. Where the purplish miasma brushed against the ancient rock, a subtle discoloration began to spread, a grayish patina that spoke of accelerated decay. It was as if the entity's essence was actively unmaking the world around it, reducing everything to its constituent elements of decay and oblivion. The moisture that occasionally trickled down the cavern wall seemed to turn viscous, almost oily, as it passed through the corrupted zones, carrying with it the faint, acrid scent of cosmic rot. This was not merely a psychic assault. It was a physical manifestation of entropic doom, a preview of the universe's eventual fate, accelerated and concentrated. The ship, the Serpent's Kiss, moored in the subterranean lake, was not immune. From its resting place its timbers groaned, a low, mournful sound that was not the creaking of wood under strain, but a lament. The lake itself, which had been unnervingly still, now began to churn with a sluggish, oily motion, as if its very waters were being infected by the same corrupting influence that plagued the air. The placid surface broke into 1,000 tiny, disturbing ripples, reflecting the warped, purplish light of the miasma in distorted patterns. It was as if the planet itself was recoiling, trying to expel the foreign, malevolent presence that had been unleashed within its depths. Captain Thorne watched, his mind a chaotic storm of regret and terror. He had envisioned himself a titan, a conqueror of forgotten realms. He had sought the power to reshape his destiny, to escape the mundane confines of mortal existence. Now, he saw his destiny as an epitaph, his conquest as the unwitting ushering in of an age of cosmic dread. The heart of malice was not a treasure. It was a testament to the profound ignorance of those who dared to pry into the universe's deepest, darkest secrets. It was the embodiment of everything that was wrong, everything that was forbidden, now unleashed upon a world that was woefully unprepared for its profound, soul-shattering nihilism. The whispers in his own mind intensified, no longer just a suggestion of futility, but a direct command to cease resistance, to embrace the inevitable dissolution. The cold was seeping into him, a welcome, agonizing relief from the burning shame of his actions. He could feel the edges of his own consciousness beginning to fray, the sharp lines of his identity blurring into the pervasive purplish haze. He was becoming part of the decay, a willing participant in his own unmaking. The purplish haze, thick and suffocating, seemed to coalesce around Thomas. He stumbled, his boots slipping on the slick ancient stone, his breath catching in his throat like a trapped bird. The whispers, once a distant murmur, now clawed at the edges of his perception, twisting the familiar into the grotesque. His meticulous maps, his life's work of charting the known world, seemed to mock him from the recesses of his mind, their lines and borders rendered meaningless by the vast, unknowable emptiness that now pressed in on all sides. He saw the world not as continents and oceans, but as a fragile shell, teeming with insignificant life, all destined to be consumed by the cosmic maw. Panic, raw and primal, seized him. He turned, an ungainly pivot that sent him lurching away from the pulsating heart of the malice, his eyes darting wildly, seeking an escape that did not exist. The cavern, once a marvel of subterranean architecture, now felt like a gaping maw, its shadows writhing with unseen horrors. He needed to run, to flee this suffocating dread, to feel the wind on his face, the sun on his skin, anything that was not this crushing, soul-annihilating despair. But his legs, heavy as lead, seemed to protest his every effort, as if the very stone beneath him had become a grasping hand, holding him fast. Then, a flicker of movement, impossibly fast, impossibly alien. It was not a physical entity, in the way he understood it, but a manifestation of the darkness itself, a writhing appendage of pure, corrupting energy. A tendril, slick and obsidian, shot out from the heart of malice, devoid of any discernible anatomy, yet possessing a terrifyingly focused intent. It moved with a speed that defied the oppressive cold, a blur against the sickly purple light. Thomas, caught in its trajectory, could only gape, his mind struggling to process the impossible. There was no time to cry out, no time to brace himself. The tendril struck his outstretched arm. It was not a blow, not a crushing grip, but an insidious embrace. A searing, unnatural heat, paradoxically originating from the pervasive cold, erupted where the tendril made contact. Thomas's eyes widened in a silent scream as his flesh began to blister, the skin turning a hideous, mottled black. It was not the charring of fire, but a rapid, terrifying desiccation, as if the very moisture of his being was being leached away. The tendril pulsed, its touch a conduit for the entity's power, and the disintegration accelerated. His leather tunic, once a sturdy protection, offered no resistance. It withered and crumbled, turning to ash as his underlying flesh followed suit. A guttural gasp escaped his lips, a strangled sound that was ripped from his lungs as the corruption spread with alarming speed. He looked down, his vision blurring, and saw his own arm dissolving, not into blood and gore, but into a fine gray dust that swirled and dissipated in the unnatural currents of the cavern. The pain was beyond anything he had ever imagined, a violation of his very essence, a burning from within that consumed him faster than any inferno. His mind, already teetering on the precipice of madness, could not withstand this final, unbearable agony. His scream, when it finally came, was not a sound of human suffering, but a raw, animalistic shriek that echoed briefly in the unnatural stillness before being swallowed by the encroaching silence. His body, that vessel of his brief existence, was no longer his own. It buckled, his legs giving way, and he fell to his knees. But even as he collapsed, the process continued. The blackening and blistering spread up his arm, consuming his shoulder, creeping towards his chest. His clothes turned to powder, his skin to dust, his very bones seeming to calcify and crumble into nothingness. Captain Thorne, frozen a few paces away, his face a mask of stark horror, could only watch. He had seen men die in battle, seen them succumb to fever and the sea's fury, but this was a desecration. Elias, standing beside him, his usually impassive face etched with a profound, chilling dread, let out a choked, involuntary sound. He had faced death countless times, but never had he witnessed a death so absolute, so utterly annihilating. It was not just the extinguishing of a life, but the unmaking of a being, a complete and utter negation. Thomas's form, a moment before a man, was now a horrific tableau of rapid decay. The tendril remained attached, a dark, unnatural limb, drawing life and substance from its victim. His body was collapsing inward, his flesh disintegrating into a fine, desiccated powder that dusted his knees and the surrounding stone. His clothes, what little remained of them, were reduced to brittle fragments. Where his arm had been, there was now a hollowed-out void, a ghostly outline filled with swirling dust. His head lolled, his eyes still wide with an unseeing terror, staring at the unholy light of the heart of malice. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream, a testament to the unimaginable suffering he had endured in his final moments. The air around him seemed to shimmer with an even more intense purplish hue, as if the very act of unmaking him was fueling the entity's power. A faint, acrid scent, like that of dried, ancient rot, wafted from his dissolving form. It was a scent that spoke of aeons of decay, of the slow, inevitable unraveling of all things. The cold seemed to deepen, to press in on Thorne and Elias, as if the void that consumed Thomas was now expanding, seeking new victims. Thorn's mind reeled. He had sought power, knowledge, a destiny beyond the ordinary. He had dreamt of dominion, of unlocking the universe's secrets, but he had unlocked a nightmare, a power that consumed and destroyed, a truth that was not one of glorious revelation, but of utter annihilation. Thomas, the quiet, diligent cartographer, whose life had been dedicated to understanding and mapping the world, had been erased from existence, reduced to a fleeting puff of dust. His maps, his careful calculations, his very presence had been utterly, irrevocably nullified by a force that defied comprehension. Elias, the pragmatist, the man who always had a plan, found himself utterly paralyzed. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his cutlass, but the gesture felt absurd, futile. What weapon could possibly combat this? What strategy could prevail against an entity that devoured existence itself? He looked at Thorn, his captain, his leader, and saw not the man who had steered them through treacherous waters, but a fellow traveler on the precipice of oblivion, his ambition having led them all to this horrific precipice. The tendril retracted, a slow, deliberate movement, leaving behind only a faint, greasy residue on the now empty space where Thomas's arm had been. The dust that had once been his body swirled and settled, a grim monument to his tragic end. The heart of Malice pulsed, its light seeming to brighten for a moment, as if in satisfaction. The whispers, though no longer directed at Thomas, seemed to intensify in Thorn and Elias's minds, a subtle hum of triumph, a promise of the inevitable. God, have mercy, Elias finally breathed, the words barely audible, thick with an awe that was inextricably bound to profound terror. He had prayed before battles, prayed for deliverance from storms, but this was a prayer for a mercy that seemed to have been utterly extinguished from the universe. He had witnessed the end of a man, not in a violent struggle for life, but in a chilling, rapid erasure, a stark and brutal demonstration of the heart of Malice's unfathomable power. The lesson was brutally clear. The universe held horrors far beyond mortal comprehension, and their quest for discovery had led them directly into the jaws of one such unspeakable dread. The dust of Thomas's remains, settling slowly on the ancient stone, served as a grim, silent testament to the price of tampering with forces best left undisturbed, a chilling prelude to the fate that might still await them all in the suffocating darkness of this accursed labyrinth. The purplish luminescence cast long, distorted shadows, making the cavern itself seem to breathe with a malevolent alien rhythm, a cosmic heart beating with the rhythm of oblivion.